Okay, so let's get started. I think most people have already joined. Now, first of all, I'll give you a quick introduction of who I am. So, I'm Rebecca, who's also the manager of the Alpha One Epping branch. So, with tonight's session, the main point is to help students and parents understand what are some really important factors you need to consider when you're selecting a selective school. So, alongside teaching in secondary schools, I've also had a lot of experience with working privately, parents and students, looking at how they can gain entry in some of the top selective schools in Sydney. And working to get into those schools, I've noticed that a lot of the times there's a lot of dedication and effort put into studying and the academic side of things. However, when it comes to actually selecting schools, some parents and students as well, they tend to lose out because they don't have all the information. Now, when you're considering what schools you want to do, it's very important to be making informed decisions. And that's not just based off the ranking of those schools. Today, we're going to be emphasizing some factors that go beyond the academic performance side of things and looking at how you should strategically select schools, location wise, what would be most beneficial for your child, and also extracurricular activities and HSC course options that are offered at different schools. So, to start off with, I think this is really important to remind everyone about, which is the fact that there's no pressing need to finalize your school selections at the moment, even though the exam is scheduled for the 4th of May, which will be for entry in 2024. You still have the ability to change your selections up until the 11th of June. So you have a bit of a grace period there to see how you perform in the exam, see what factors contribute to the school that you want to spend your next 6 years at, and then change or make any adjustments on your selections based off that. So this is a really good time as well to gain some more insight into the different schools and what are some of the things that you value in high school. Okay, so leading on to our first thing that we'll talk about today is location. Now, this is a really common question we get asked at the center where parents are having a bit of trouble deciding between a school which is higher in ranking versus one that is closer or more convenient location wise. Now, even though every answer is quite dependent on a student or family's individual situation, I think it's quite important to not overlook the importance that location can have. So, to give a bit of context as well, we find that most students who are going to a local school in a local catchment area probably spend between 5 to 25 minutes on public transport or getting driven to school. Now, it's very common if you attend a selective school to spend more so around 20 minutes to an hour on public transport. It's not really the location, how far it is, that's significant, but the extent to which you value your time and the extent to which you're spending time wise on public transport. Now, some of the benefits to having to travel is the fact that a majority of your school, probably 80 to 90%, will actually come from non local areas. So, most of the students are spending quite a bit of time on public transport. That also means you'll be traveling as a fairly large group. And a lot of the times, students or families will arrange for traveling where they're not going on transport alone. So you'll be able to travel with your friends or maybe with a group of friends. Now, the locality and the school and the time that you spend on transport can still greatly affect those next 6 years. And if you think about it, it's quite a long time. If you add up all of those weekdays, all of those weeks and years that go into your high school schooling career, and that ends up being a lot of time. So, thinking about how you'll be able to effectively utilize that time, whether you do have to travel or you live fairly close, that's something which I think parents really want to consider and also discuss with their child how much they value that part of their time. So, another impact that you want to think about is whether it will affect extracurricular activities that you do. So you'll find that if you're waking up at 6, 7 a.m. to get to school, a lot of things such as music, band, that might be before or after school, right? Early in the morning. So that's something which you may not have time for if you're dedicating a large portion of time to transport. Also, after school, it's quite common again for selective students, as we all know, part of the culture, to have to spend a lot of time maybe going to tutoring afterwards or doing extracurriculars, piano, music, anything, sports. And a whole chunk of that time can be taken up if you're, again, spending a lot of time on transport. So it does depend on individual circumstance, but it's something that you really do want to consider and maybe prioritize depending on the rankings of different schools that you're looking at. So the final thing that comes with location is safety. So it's quite common for selective school students to, again, have to commute a moderate distance to get to school. And this is usually in the company of their peers or friends. But if a school is too far away, and depending on where it is demographically, you may also want to think about either moving or consider choosing a school that's closer to you. So you don't really want your child spending too much time on public transport to the point where it becomes unsafe. And yeah, safety is a very big consideration. So I think in conclusion, when you are selecting the right school, it does involve quite a few factors, as we've seen with location. And that's to ensure your child is thriving both academically and personally in their social life. Okay. So while we're going through this as well, if you have any questions, feel free to pop that into the chat, and we will have a bit of a Q&A towards the middle and end of the session today. But if anything comes to mind, if you want to ask or share any thoughts, please feel free to throw that in the chat. So the next thing that we'll take a look at is minimum entry scores and cutoffs. Now, as a lot of people may know, there's been quite a few changes in the past few years where the government has adjusted the way that students' scores are released and also how we're able to access old data. Now, these changes have a pretty big impact on students who are taking the exam this year and in following years. So understanding a bit more about minimum entry marks and a cutoff score is probably going to help you in deciding which school you want to choose. So there are also some strategies that we'll examine today. When it comes to minimum entry scores, you are usually evaluated based on your performance. So this will be purely based on the placement test. There's no consideration of school marks in, I think, the past couple of years. They've gotten rid of that. So the ranking that you do get based on that exam will be used to determine whether you gain entry into a certain school or not. And it also depends on the number of vacancies at those schools. Now, with marks, as a lot of parents who have older kids may know, it used to be based off a system where it's out of 300, which then got changed to 120. And in recent years, student performances have been released in the form of bands. So very similar to what you'll see in NAPLAN. You get a band that ranges from the top 10%, top 15, top 25, and top 50. So that's how each of your subjects are broken down into. And that's how you'll be able to access and see how you've performed. So it's based on these bands. So the idea of this change is it's actually intended to benefit students. And it comes from the fact that it's reducing unhealthy competition. A lot of the times, even after selective ends, these marks are used to compare students, and there's competition between kids in schools. So the government does have good intentions with these changes where they're trying to prevent this unhealthy competition. However, the downside of it is that we also have less transparency with these results. We don't really see exactly where we are. We don't really have an idea of exactly where or which schools we might be able to get into based on the cutoff marks. Now, because it makes it less transparent, it is also harder to gauge where your child might perform based on past information. So we'll take a look at how you can make selections based off other factors. So for those that haven't really done much prep tests or haven't really done a lot of trial tests leading up to the selective, and you don't really know where to start in terms of selecting a school, we'd probably recommend a few things. So getting a lot of practice with old papers, any resources that you can get your hands on, and identifying areas where you need to improve. That's all of the general academic side of things. Now, when you do have some data or some idea of how your child is going, knowing what their averages are or how they're performing, you can use OC or selective calculators to get a rough idea of where they're sitting. Now, this can help you position a child and identify potential schools that they can get into based off those marks. These tests can also help you figure out what exactly they might be struggling with in terms of losing out on marks. Maybe it's the test anxiety side of things, maybe it's a specific topic area. Otherwise, just giving them general confidence and allowing them to have a bit of practice is going to be very, very helpful. Okay. Now, it's important to remember that overall, the exam isn't really about how well you do. That is a factor, but it's a comparative exam. So, this means ranking is very important. And that's what the government is going to look at when they're allocating you as a school. Even if you do really well, if everyone else does well, then that pushes you down. So, ranking is very important, and you want to base off that component, or you want to figure out which school to put down based off those factors. So, ranking. Now, it's also a reason why exams are useful because you will get a bit of an idea of where you place amongst the cohort and amongst other students who are potentially going to be doing the exams. Now, the next part is more catered to those who have already done some sort of STTC exam trial test course. And we'll talk about how you can interpret those results that you've gotten. With the ones that students have done at Alpha 1, you'll receive a report that contains your child's mark. Now, we still do base off the mark of 120, which is where all of our old data comes from. So that's probably the most reliable way for us to gauge where your child is at. Now, you'll get a mark and you'll also get a recommendation of schools. And this is color coded based on whether they're highly likely to get in, somewhat likely, or unlikely to make it into a particular school. So the first one, which is red, orange, and then green for most likely to be able to gain entry into. Now, if you do find that your results are fluctuating a lot, meaning your rank is sitting around plus or minus 20 to 30 each time. If you're outside of that range, we'd say that it's considered there's a bit of fluctuation between your marks, right? So you want fairly consistent marks. Across maybe 3 to 4 tests, you want to be getting in between that range of plus or minus 20 to 30 students. Now, if you do find that your results are fairly consistent, you're getting very similar rankings each time, what you can do is based off that, choose one school in the red zone that you would want to make into, one in the orange, and one in the green that may be slightly lower down as a safety net. So that's probably what we'd recommend if your marks are quite stable. Now, if you're on the other side of the spectrum where your marks are moving a lot, they're not very consistent, we'd recommend you take the average and then based off that, selecting a red or orange school and perhaps 2 green schools. So that will allow you to, again, have that safety net there where if you're not certain whether you'll make it into one of those higher schools, you still have a lower one that's catching you. So that's the way to go about selection, which we recommend based off those reports that you're getting. And if you have done, again, trial tests, not with Alpha 1, we do have those online calculators, which are very helpful. So knowing your marks, throw that into the calculator, see what it recommends. It will also give you that school breakdown of red, orange, and green. And you can take a look at what potential schools you might be able to make it into. Okay, so before we move on, I'll just take a quick look at the chat and see what questions that everyone's been asking. Okay, so a lot of questions about travel, which which I'll get back to. So good questions. I think as well, that's something I forgot to mention, but for the OC process, very similar. We do have a calculator for that as well. If you're looking at doing OC this year or in following years, you again can attempt some of those test papers, especially the past ones that the government has on their website. Make sure to have a go at those before the real exam. Once you've done that, throw those marks in and see what it's showing you. Okay. All right, so I think a good question here about how each question, whether it's worth 1 point or not. So based on past data, the government doesn't always allocate 1 mark to each question. Now, this is more so for the writing component where you'll find weighting is different. And I won't go too in depth into this, but pretty much different sections of the test have different weighting or different significance. You'll find that if you do better in certain areas or certain subjects, it may have a heavier contribution to the final mark. Mm. Yeah, so the calculator as well is located on our website. I believe it's under resources. So if you just go onto the website, have a browse there, or even just type in Alpha One Selective and OC calculator, that should pop up for you. Okay. All right, so for the next part, this is more for the parents out there who are watching tonight. It's looking at offers. Now, any type of communication that the Department of Education has with you is probably going to be through email. And you also gain a link where you can log into your dashboard. So a lot of stuff is done through the dashboard. Make sure to keep on top of that. Now, once you do receive an offer, you will have to log into your account and either accept or decline that. And if you do go past a certain time period, it can automatically decline. So you may risk losing a spot. So with selections as well, you do have three selections or three options that you can put down in terms of the preferences. Now, always make sure you put your first preference or the school that you most want to attend in first place. The way that preferences work is if you do make it into the first preference, they will automatically offer you that and you won't be able to accept your second or third preference. However, if you don't make it into your first and you do make it into your second, then the first and second will be unavailable unless you're on a wait list. So try not to put down schools that may not actually be your most preferred school. Try to avoid putting something that's higher ranked down, even though you don't really want to go there. So always look at putting down your first preference in that first spot. Okay. The next thing we'll talk about is reserve lists. So if you do choose to accept an offer from one school, they can still remain on the waitlist for a higher ranked school. So just because you accept it doesn't mean that you lose the spot. If your child's position on the wait list for a higher ranking school does become available, you'll also get another notification, which is the offer that you'll receive. So if you do accept that subsequent offer, the original one will automatically be declined. But if you do decline your second offer, then you'll still hold on to your original one. Now, that's of course unless you choose to decline it as well. So I think, again, just make sure you stay on top of any communication because there is a certain time period from which you are able to accept or decline. Now, if your child remains on a higher ranked school's waiting list, you may receive a third offer if their position on that list ends up opening up. And this usually depends on other parents, whether they've accepted or declined. But the reserve list is usually given in the form of A, B, C, D, I think up to E. And usually there's a time frame indication for each of those letters as well. So I think A is roughly a month, B being 2 months. But that, again, is all on the government website. You can take a look at that. So if you no longer wish for your child to be on a waiting list, do make sure to withdraw that application and that spot will go to the next student. But I think if you are waiting for a higher school, then you can accept something else in the meantime and wait for that. So all that information should be available and will be communicated to you via your dashboard or via any government communication as well. So make sure to check their website and just understand that information for yourself. So the last thing we'll talk about is the equity placement model under the school selection topic. So in the past few years, when the equity placement model first came out, we had a lot of parents who were quite concerned about this and wanted to ask us, see what advice we could offer, and if they had to adapt or change their selections because of this new model that they put in place. So the idea behind this is that 20% of eligible spots are offered to students who are disadvantaged. Now, looking at what's happened in previous years, not all of those 20% of spots were actually taken up. So I think last year, only 8.7% was actually given out to those disadvantaged students. So that's around less than half the equity places available. Now, it's not really going to have a big impact on whether your child makes into the school that they want or not, but it's more for you to think about, again, whether you would like to put in a highly ranked school a mid-ranked school and a lower ranked, and just again the safety net for your child. But I think with most parents concerned, it's not going to have a really big impact on your child and if they get into the school or not. So the majority of those places were offered to general applicants, and partially selective regional agricultural high schools tend to take up a higher amount of those disadvantaged spots. Most students also offered equity places ended up having test scores that were comparable to those that would have made it in if they weren't disadvantaged. So again, it's not a really big disadvantage to students who are, well, the overall cohort which is taking the exam, and it's not something that parents should be too concerned about. Okay. All right, so for the next part, we'll talk about extracurriculars and how this can have a big impact on your child's schooling career, and also whether they find those 6 years fulfilling or not. So the first thing is sports teams. Now, this is very significant, I think, across all schools. They have some sort of sports program and they encourage students to join and participate in those. Now, sporting teams is mainly just for you to develop fitness, teamwork, leadership skills, also time management skills. So, a very common thing that a lot of schools offer. And I think a lot of parents would also know certain schools are more well known for their sporting programs. So, you have schools such as Sydney Boys, where they encourage a lot of sports, they participate um, in a lot of competitions as well. Just one second, check the messages. Okay. All right. So the next thing that we'll examine as well is music programs. That's another huge thing across schools. So personally, I went to Fort Street High School. Sports was okay at Fort Street. We had them available, but it was more up to students themselves to actively engage and participate in these sporting programs. Music, however, was a really huge thing at Fort Street. So while I was there, I ended up picking up learning the cello. So this is around year 9, where I had a lot of friends who participated in band, and that actually encouraged me to actively join. And I picked up the cello. It was really fun. I feel like I learned a lot from that, and being able to go compete in competitions, even though I was playing at a very beginner level, it was a really good experience to have. And I think being in that environment where they try, nurture, and nourish students' love for music or for sports, that's something which really adds to the overall high school experience. Okay. So in terms of drama programs, that's usually another really common thing. At 4th Street, it was a really big program that we had. So, drama programs can usually help students improve in a lot of different areas. So, more socially, they can improve public speaking, boosting your confidence, developing creativity, and also self expression. So, if there are students who are interested in that, you may want to consider researching and looking at schools which do offer these programs. And I'd say here that a lot of this is for the students who are watching tonight. It's your job to go home, do this homework, research the schools that you really had your heart set on, and just understand a little more about them. Location wise, as well, that's something for you to look at because you'll be the one spending the next 6 years having to travel that distance. So make sure it's something that you're comfortable with and something that you're really excited and looking forward to doing. Okay. Another extracurricular, debating and public speaking clubs. So these are quite popular again across most schools. Again, it's usually something that students have to actively go seek out, go understand, and join. Now, this is going to help develop a lot of things as well, such as critical thinking, your communication skills, argumentation skills, and also improving your confidence and ability to think on your feet. So, a really good program debating, which I'm sure a lot of people have joined throughout primary school as well. Volunteering, science clubs, coding, and robotics. These are also some things that a lot of schools offer. Now, depending on the particular extracurricular, you'll find that some end up being an after school activity. So, this links back to when we talked about location wise. If you do decide to participate in a lot of these extracurriculars, make sure you have the time and energy and effort to dedicate to them. Okay. Um, a few more. So, in terms of academics, a lot of schools offer Olympiad, especially selective. So with Olympiad, it's basically an exterior test or exam that you'll be doing. It's in school. But for those that who perform very highly or perform very well, they do get the chance to go over to Canberra and do a bit more study based on those maths or science, mainly STEM subjects. So that's another really good opportunity. Not all schools will highly promote that because it does take away from your time to study the school syllabus and the school content, but that's to keep an eye out for and watch out for while you're in high school. Okay. Let's have a look at if anyone has any questions. Again, if there's anything you're unsure about from the stuff that I've mentioned, make sure you put it in the chat and I'll have the chance to go through and answer any questions later on. Okay, so I think there was a question about weighting with the exam. I think previously weighting was done where maths, thinking skills, and English carried the same weighting, but writing was a little bit lower. So it's a bit different now. Again, I've mentioned that the government has decided to change much of what information they release, and it's a lot less clear. But the rough idea would still be fairly similar, where I wouldn't say there's a huge difference in the weighting of different subjects, but you would want to consider, for example, with writing, it's usually a little bit lighter compared to the others. Okay, OC and selective. OC is a little bit different because it doesn't have that writing component. With OC, I don't think we have any information on previous exams, but I say they roughly be fairly similar. So your maths, English, and thinking skills, they'll be quite similar. Okay, another question on percentile. Yep, so I think that relates back to the bands which we're talking about. So if it's top 10%, it's just out of the cohort or those who participated in the test. If you've scored within the top 10% of students, that will be indicated on your report versus 25, that's within the top 25% of all students. So that's generally percentile. It's just dependent on how you do with the exam. How to apply for OC, higher ranking first or okay, with OC, I'd say it's the same process. If you do have a school that you want to get into, a school that you have in mind, put it in terms of preference. Now, ranking wise, I think majority of people, the higher ranking the school is, that's usually your higher preference. But when I talk about putting down a school that you prefer to get into over one that's of higher ranking, it's more looking at other factors combined. So this includes location, whether transportation is easy or it's very far away. Even if something is higher ranking, but it's taking you 2 hours to get there, that's not a realistic travel time. Okay, and all right, I'll come back to the questions in a moment, but we'll take another look at the fourth thing I want to talk about, which is HSC rankings and also selective rankings for OC and selective. So when we're looking at HSC rankings from selective high schools, it's important to consider the subjects that they offer and especially accelerated programs. So we have something which we call the Accelerated High School Certificate Pathway. And this is typically for students who want to do a HSC course slightly in advance. Now, it enables selected students to take accelerated courses, and it usually ranges across different schools, but you can start in year 9 or year 10 and actually allows you to complete a few of those courses a little bit earlier. Now, by partially completing these subjects before the start of HSC in year 11, you can actually devote a little bit more attention to the remaining subjects that you have once year 11 and year 12 hits. And that's going to increase your chance of academic excellence by lightening the load and pressure for those remaining subjects. Additionally, you do have that advantage where you've already done a HSC course and you already understand the examination process, getting into a good habit of studying as well to prepare for the exam when HSC eventually hits. So I think it's not something that everyone really knows about. And once you get into high school, it's something that they'll tell you, but most students don't really understand the process. It is actually doing your HSC or a few subjects in advance. So, depending on which school as well, not all courses are offered. So, when I was in Fort Street, we had Earth and Environmental Science, which I don't actually think they have anymore, but that and also business studies. So those were some of the accelerated courses that we have. And once year 9 and year 10 hit, there was a group of students who chose to do those in advance. And that's what they studied throughout years 9 and 10. And they got rid of one of the subjects that they would have needed for the HSC, meaning that they got to do less work when it was year 11 and 12. And they can devote more time to those other subjects. Okay, and the fifth thing we'll take a look at is open day. So, when you're going in to visit a school, a lot of these schools will give you the chance to visit and just see what the area is like, see what the school itself is like, and visit the facilities. But attending an open day can give you a lot of benefits, especially if you're a prospective student. First of all, you get to have a first-hand look at the school's facilities, their resources, also the environment of the school. You can explore the classrooms, the labs, sports facilities, and other areas of the school, get a sense of what it's really like to be a student there. Additionally, you can meet some of the staff and also current students, and that allows you to foster a bit of a relationship with the seniors that you'll eventually be sharing school with. So, by actually visiting the school, you can probably make more informed decisions about whether you want to attend the school or not for the next 6 years of your life. But a lot of the times, open days also offer presentations and they'll give you a quick rundown of what the school has, what kind of extracurriculars they'll offer. They might give you some demonstrations and also a few interactive activities that you can engage in. Now, based on those, you'll be able to get a deeper understanding of the school culture, what it's really like, and whether you'll enjoy spending the next few years at this particular school. So, it's also going to help you a little bit if you do eventually go to the school. Acclimatizing to that environment is going to assist you when you're a year 7 on the first day and it's quite scary. So, familiarizing with that school environment, knowing your way around, knowing the teachers and staff there is going to help reduce a lot of that anxiety, which comes with being a new student or transitioning to a new school. So, that's going to help you a lot and make your journey into high school a little more positive and a bit more smooth. So, going to an open day is going to be a really good opportunity for any students who do decide to go to that school. And it's a chance for you to ask a lot of questions, gather more information, and make a decision about your educational future. Okay. All right. So I think now that we've gone through most of the things, the factors that are involved in school selection, we'll do a quick Q&A session. So if you had any questions about those things we talked about, just pop it into the chat and I'll try to go through those. Okay, so one about time management. Someone is asking about tips for time management. So this is back to the more academic side of things. If you're looking at time management, or if you do find that you're running out of time to complete the entire test, I think the first thing to look for is what's causing that, because it may not always be time management. Now, if you find that halfway into the exam, you're struggling on some questions, you're spending more time on them, you're not able to actively move on, it's good to set some barriers. So maybe saying, I'm going to spend 1 minute on each question. Now, if it doesn't take you 1 minute to complete, that's perfectly fine, move on. But for any questions that you come across, making sure to stick to a very strict time limit. But the other factors involved is usually understanding of the content. So if you're spending a long time on questions, either you haven't really mastered the content, you don't really understand what it's asking, which is why it's taking you a long time to read and think about and break down, or it could be that you haven't found an effective way to solve the question. Now, this is mainly in maths and thinking skills. I don't think a lot of kids find that they lack time in the reading component. Mainly, it's I didn't understand this text. I didn't really understand what the question's asking. Therefore, I've left it or I've come back and just had to guess, right? So you don't really run out of time in reading, but maths and thinking skills is very common. So when I say you haven't really found a way to efficiently solve the question, that's more doing practice, knowing the question style, and also understanding what's being asked. So with maths, it's usually not too tricky because if you understand the concept and you understand how to approach a particular topic, break down that question, then you're able to solve it quite quickly. So that's more of a conceptual thing. But with thinking skills, a lot of the times it's you haven't really found an effective method to solve the question. So with time management, I think just identifying which area it is, whether it's more a understanding side of things or you're not having the self-discipline to really strictly stay with the time limit allocated per question. That's probably what you want to look at and try to figure out before targeting time management. So OC, internal school marks. OC and selective, they're both based on your exam marks, so purely exam marks. In past years, selective, they did go off school marks. When I did the selective test, I think it was half half. So half of it was based on your school and what your teacher gave you, and the other half was from the exam itself, which a lot of parents, I think, found that to be somewhat unfair, and the government did eventually change that to make it purely based on the exam. Mm. Is 111.75 high level or average? Is that out of 120? Just to clarify. So who asked that question? I think it was Sarah, right? Okay, so I'm assuming you're asking out of 120 for selective. Um, Look, based on that mark, I think if you're averaging around 111, that's a fairly decent score. So that's a fairly solid score. You're probably going to have to look at schools that are ranked within the top 10, I'd say. It's probably hard to get into James Bruce and Balcombe Hill with a score of 111, but if you're looking at schools within the top 10, I think you can probably select three within that range, or probably top 15, I'd say. Mhm. Okay, so Craig asks if two students receive the same mark, will the one who puts it as first preference have an advantage over someone who lists it second? Okay, so it depends. First of all, the government does look at rankings. So whichever school is higher or has a higher cutoff mark, which we're unable to view, but within their own system, they will have certain cutoff marks for school. That's how they'll decide whether a student gets in or not. We just don't have that information. But if you get the same mark, if that mark is able to get you into a school, then you'll gain entry. But if that mark gets you into, so for example, with one student who puts it as first, if that mark allows you to gain entry, then yes, you will receive an offer. But for the other student, if the school you've put as first preference is a higher mark, then you will gain entry into your second preference. But if the school you put as first preference is actually lower, then you'll get into the first preference rather than second preference. I hope that made sense. But yeah, it just depends on the marks of the school that you put down rather than your mark. And Darren's asking, really wants to know about Conservatorium High School. Okay, I'm assuming that you're fairly interested in music. That's what they're very well known for. Conservatorium is a interesting school. You do have to get in based off the selective exam, but yeah, very focused on music. If that's not something you want to go down the path of, then I'd say really consider whether that's the school for you. But if you do want to get in, I think they also have exams and they also test you on your musical abilities. So it's a mix of both academic and music. Okay, another question. Why should we choose something in the red zone if we have no chance of getting in? Okay, so red zone doesn't really indicate that you have no chance because just remember that every year school ranking changes, right? The schools itself, they're going to rank differently. And your mark based on the trial test that you've done versus in the final exam is also not set in stone. So if you think about it, the red is more just an indicator that based off your current progress, you're going to have a bit of difficulty or there's a bit of uncertainty making it into. Now, there's an extent to that as well. If your recommended scores in the green zone are fairly low, like you're getting partially selectives or you're not making it to any school, then it's not realistic to put down a red school such as Roos or Borkham Hills. But if you're only 2 or 3 schools away, then you still have a fair chance, depending on how hard you work in the last few weeks, depending on how you perform on the day. If you're able to execute everything really well, you still have a chance of making it in. And I said this earlier, but the whole exam is comparative. So it's not about how well you do, it's about how everyone does as a cohort. Yeah, and I think to say that you have no chance of getting in is a bit of an overstatement. Look at the way that the schools are organized. If there are a lot of schools in the red zone, don't go for something that's too high. Go for something that's a little bit lower in the red zone, or go for something that's in the orange zone and have a safety net for your green zones. Okay, so if a student gets 14 out of 20 for writing, 55% for thinking skills and maths, and 70% for English, what school slash colors would be convenient to choose? Girls' schools preferably. Okay, good question. So, first of all, I think because you already have that data there, that's really good. Throw that into the calculator, see what it recommends, first of all. But based off those marks, I think thinking skills is something that's dragging you down a little bit. So, thinking skills and maths, actually. So, those two are probably the ones that I'm going to look at in terms of where you want to restrict your selections. You're probably not going to go for something that's too high. So, top 5 to 10 schools. I think maybe having one selection amongst those and the rest going into something that's a little bit lower in ranking. Yeah. But definitely use our calculator for that one. I think having such data is going to help you a lot in knowing where you might be able to gain entry into. Mhm. How to apply for conservatorium. This is where you need to do your homework. You can go research the school, figure out what other processes for entry. Sounds like you're very keen on how to get in, which is great. So don't let mum and dad or your teacher do all the hard work for you. Go seek out what the options are, and hopefully you make it in. Partial versus full selective. Okay, let's quickly talk about that. So let me just adjust. So with partial selectives, the way that they work is usually a portion of the school consists of selective students. So full selective schools is the entire school. Everyone has done the selective test process. Everyone's made it in because they've got the entry score. Partial selective consists of part of the school being local students, so within the local catchment area, and the other part are from those who have done the test. Now, most of the time, I think in junior years, they'll try separate or at least put you in classes where you're within that cohort, either local students or those that gain entry through a selective test. So it is separated in junior years, but towards senior, and this might be different for certain schools, but in your senior years, you will end up being in mixed classrooms. So I think that's something you'd want to consider whether to go to a fully selective school or a partially selective school, based on the fact that you may eventually be put into a mixed classroom. You may eventually experience scenarios where there are students who don't work as hard or don't really strive to perform as well academically. And if that you feel like might impact your own ability to learn, then you should consider whether you want to put down options for fully or partially selective. Mm, Okay, what minimum bands are required to enter Borkham, Hornsby, and Fort Street selective schools? Um, okay, minimum bands. I think if you're aiming for one of the top few schools, so James Roos, Borkham Hills, North Sydney, Sydney boys, girls, I think for those aiming to get at least three subjects in the top 10% and maybe having one in 15. But I'd say for something like Roos, you're aiming for all of them to be in the top 10%. Hornsby and Fort Street, which are generally a little bit lower, I'd say there's a little bit more leeway for that. If you do score a little more poorly in one area, you do have a good chance of still getting into one of those schools. But yeah, if you're looking at one of those higher rankings, top three, top five, then really consistent across all your subjects. That's something which is key to making it into those schools. Mm. And another question, do tuition places usually make their practice test more difficult than the actual selective exam? I won't talk on behalf of other places, but for Alpha, I think all the students who have come, you have a fairly good idea of what the level is like. So we aim to make our exams very similar to that of the selective. So as close as possible, I'd say. Of course, there's always going to be variation where some tests are a little bit easier, some weeks are going to be a bit harder, but we try get it as close as possible. So you're not doing anything that's too difficult, anything that's too easy. Ken asks, which schools should you pick if the Alpha 1 report says all the schools are green? Okay, well, first of all, Ken, if that's your situation, you're very lucky. But if you are getting all green schools, think about where you really want to go. So, first of all, which area are you located in? Think about how long you're going to spend on travel if you're looking at moving to the school that you get entry into. This is where you have a lot more flexibility in considering the other factors that you value, right? So, of course, I'd always recommend putting down the highest schools if you're able to gain entry into those, because in your next 6 years, you're going to be working and studying alongside students who are very academically similar to you in their abilities, right? But all green, I think a good spread, probably James Roos, one of the North Sydney or Sydney schools. And then you can always put down one that's a little bit lower, which is just, again, a safety net for if you don't perform to your best ability in the exam. So I'd always recommend Fort Street because I had a great time there. Okay, next question. What are the cutoff marks for OC school? For example, Ironbark or Quakers Hill? Okay, so for OC, um, I think that's something which you want to look at what it was in the past year. There are a lot of good websites that you can take a look at. So do a bit of research for those because it is different every year. There's not a very specific cutoff mark for every single year. It varies a lot. Same with selective schools. It depends on the performance of those HSC students every year, and that's what impacts the rankings. But take a look at past years. That's something which you can find with an easy Google search. So I recommend taking a look at those, seeing roughly what they average each year, and that could give you a good indication of what to expect. Does orange zone mean I could get a reservation at least? So you're asking about being on the reserve list. So with those school recommendations, I'd say consider consistency. Consistency is key in this case. If you're getting 4 or 5 weeks or throughout the term, you're getting very similar schools in the orange zone, most likely you can get on the reserve list for one of those. But if you find that your marks are fluctuating a lot, sometimes you're getting in that orange zone, sometimes not, then it's a bit trickier to say. I'd still recommend putting it down, but that just comes down to whether it's first, second, or third preference. Okay. Rupa asks, how important is um, ASAT score compared to Alpha 1 reports? Maybe just clarify that question for me. What do you mean by how important? Like overall, what's being given? Because the reports that we provide is more just an indication. It's just to help you figure out what school you're most likely to get into. So Craig asks, what would you suggest the kids do the day before the test? Any strategy to let kids relax, not too nervous about the test? I think in terms of just feeling comfortable during the test, that comes with long-term preparation. If they've done a lot of these exams and they know what they're in for, I think that helps a lot. Of course, because it's very close to the test, just getting into good habits, making sure that there's no big disruption to their environment, that would really help allowing them to stay comfortable, relaxed, making sure they get enough sleep. I think that's very general. But yeah, I think just getting into that habit leading up to test day, they're doing the same thing or very similar things every day. There's nothing big right beforehand or any big changes to their schedule. How many students get accepted into a selective school every year? How many selective school seats are there? How many practice sit the exam? The amount of people that sit the test, I think it's roughly it was either 10 or 15,000, I think that sit the test. So around that number, different every year, but you're looking at roughly those numbers. How many students get accepted? It depends. So for each school, you're looking at roughly 150 spots. So if you think about that for a fully selective school, if you have 150 students being accepted, and for partially selective, maybe they have two classes or half the school, then you can sort of see or calculate roughly how many altogether. If one slot is available in a school, and who will get that slot? Mm, that's a good question. See, the thing is, when we say that there's a certain number of spots available, that's an indication, right? We don't really know. And sometimes, if a school does have to fit extra students, they will. As we all know, some schools are very packed at the moment. But I wouldn't say that's strictly down to there's one spot available. These kids both have the same chance of making it in. Who's going to get it? I think if it does come down to something like that, I'm sure the government has a fair way of adjusting spots for those situations. Going to a good private school is better than going to a selective school. In view of getting better results at HSC, mm, I'd say there are definitely some private schools that are very, very competitive in terms of their academic performance. So, a school like Sydney Grammar, for example, if you look at their past rankings, they are very high. So, almost equivalent to some of our top top selective schools. So, it depends on which private school, but I do see the benefits of private schools overall. I did have a very close friend who went to Barker College, and from his experience, he always likes to say that he found it to be a very well-rounded culture there. So the whole school is very good at promoting students, getting them into participating in sports and extracurriculars. Whereas at selective, it might be more of a um, it's more dependent on students themselves seeking out opportunities. But yeah, I definitely say that private school has its benefits, and depending on which one, you can definitely do very well in HSC as well. Indication of bands for Normanhurst. Oh, Normanhurst very tricky. They vary a lot in their marks. I don't think I can give you an exact number of what you're looking at. Again, it just depends on how they end up ranking from year to year. But yeah, they tend to vary quite a bit. What if the weekly practice scores were varied every week? Should we average it? Um, Yes, definitely. So if you fluctuate a lot in terms of the marks you're getting, I definitely recommend averaging. But the other thing is trying to figure out what's causing that fluctuation, or even just knowing what you did well in for that particular week and trying to learn from that for the next test and try and improve on that. So, um, yeah, looking at what factors really contributed to that and trying to get rid of them in your final exam is going to help. And then if you do look at averaging, hopefully you'll perform better than what your average is. Yep. So current Alpha 1 score only represents for 600 to 1000. How's this percentile change with actual exams? So based off of that, with the current cohort, it is between 600 to 1000. So you'll find that with the reports, it's out of those kids. But from the data that we pull, it's based on previous years as well. So if you think about it, for the last 4 or 5 years, adding all of that together, we get a much larger student pool, and we're looking at data from those students. Now, if you're comparing that then to 15,000 kids, a majority of them won't be accepted, or majority of them may not have done tutoring, but I think it's just amplifying that, making sure we're not too off in terms of our calculations. And if you're looking at percentile, again, you're just amplifying some of that data. I'm not too sure. We have our special data science guy who does all of the reports. So you guys can trust that. It is fairly accurate. I'm not too sure about the specifics, but there is a lot of adjusting that goes into it to make sure we account for those different factors. Yeah. Eugene asks if our estimated OC test score is 75, then which would be the preferred school? Ironbark ranking is 235, which is not out of 120. How to compare? So OC, I think the one you're looking at is based off that past mark. So when it was still out of 300. With OC, you're trying to change that score, or at least looking at the rankings and just there's a bit of maths involved, but you can adjust that score and see roughly where it fits out of 120. And you can do that for the different scores. But I recommend using the calculator, throw in your marks, seeing what you're getting. And I think the calculator, I'm not sure if it has an indication of school marks, but you might want to take a look at those. Um, Bands for Penrith High. Penrith, I think you're probably looking at some more accommodating marks. So if you're not getting top 10 or 15 percentile in everything, that's not too bad. I think you're aiming for 25s, 15s, and 10s. So mainly trying to get everything into the top 15% would be a good goal. But yeah, Penrith varies a little bit, hard to say, but if you're aiming for 15s for most of your subjects, then I think that's a good chance of getting into it. Oh, okay. I like this question. So Wendy asks, according to the Department of Education, tuition is not necessary to succeed in OC exams, and that most kids that do well in the OC test had not had tuition. What are your thoughts? I agree and disagree. I agree in the fact that the test itself is meant to test cognitive thinking, the way you're able to process questions. But realistically, if you encounter a question and you can't understand what the question is asking, you don't understand the English behind that question, there's no way you're going to be able to do it. So, the idea of coaching, I think, is to help those students figure out what they're going to be disadvantaged in when they do eventually do that exam. So, understanding the question types, which is going to help a lot, being able to go through the process of testing. So, that's another thing which I found. A lot of our WMT kids, which is another course that we have, but a majority of WMT kids which come in for class, they do a lot of learning, they do a lot of theory, go through all of those questions. At the end of the term, when they do the term test, we get quite a handful every term who really struggle and they underperform. Now, I think the main factor which goes into this underperformance is the fact that they've never done a test before or they haven't done these test type questions. So, what we find is once these kids transition into a trial test course, such as OCTT or STTC, they tend to do a lot better from the first 2 weeks that they do the exam. So it's that adjustment period as well. If your child has never done an exam before, they've never had to do questions under time restraints, you're really disadvantaged in terms of being able to come into an exam prepared and knowing what to look out for and making sure that they make the most of that exam. So even though the content itself is more targeted at kids who already understand, it's more targeted at cognitive thinking. I'd say with coaching, it's more so about knowing exam technique, making sure they can identify which components of theory that they need to work on. And it's just helping make sure that whatever they're capable of, they can achieve that in the final exam. Um, Comment around private schools. How would you rate Hill's grammar? Okay, I'm not too familiar with Hill's grammar. Um, my overall impression of it is that I think it's a fairly decent school. I haven't heard anyone who had a really bad experience there or really good experience, but yeah, I think Hill's Grammar is a decent school if you are looking at more so the private side and you don't really want to go down that public school route, then you can definitely consider that school. Okay, and final few questions. We've got what schools would be good for 22 out of 30 in English, 23 out of 35 in maths, and 31 out of 40 in thinking skills, and 23 out of 25 in writing. Writing, I believe, would be out of 20. But for this, looks like your maths and thinking skills marks are okay. Could be a little bit higher, but for something like that, again, I wouldn't recommend putting all of your selections in, for example, top 5 or top 8 schools. I think just having a good spread of preferences is going to help make sure you get into at least something. Okay, 2 years ago, your brother got 106 out of 20 and got into James Roos. So I think another really important thing to remember is that it's comparative. Based on those marks, if they got 110 out of 120, but so did 50% of all the other kids, then that's going to push them down. So it just depends on cutoff mark as well. But if everyone performed very poorly because it was a hard exam that year, then yes, you can potentially get in with a lower mark. If you usually get the school you want, is it a safe option to put it down? If you mean like on the reports, you're usually getting greens for that school. Yes, definitely. And if, especially if it's a school that you want to, you can put it down as first, and your other options, you're free to choose any other two. But yeah, definitely, you would put that down. Better to go partially selective or choose a better local private school. I wouldn't say really one over the other. I think it's what you value and what you look for in a school. Remember, selective schools, even partial ones, you're attending with a cohort of students that really push academically. And with private, it's probably not going to be as an academic of an environment. They're going to value other things a little bit more. So you're maybe looking at more sports, more extracurricular. The school itself isn't going to have a curriculum that caters to someone who's gifted or talented. So you may want to consider those aspects of it, what you really value. Do you really want to be with students who you think are going to try strive really hard to do well, or maybe those that value other components of their life, such as social, sporting? Yeah. So I think that's a question to ask yourself. Are the coaching class tests difficult than the actual selective paper? I can speak on behalf of Alpha One. We try and make our tests as similar as we can. I think if you're doing fairly well or you're finding the questions to be fairly easy, that's a really good sign. But if you are struggling with inconsistent marks, or you find that there's certain aspects which you're lacking in, then um, yeah, it could be an indication of how you'll perform in the real exam. Okay, so I'll probably spend 3 more minutes answering Q&As, and then I'm gonna go to quickly talk about just some past experiences of a few of our tutors, and we'll answer a few more questions, then wrap up for today. If a student is in the 25% band consistently, what schools do we select? Would Penrith be a better choice, or Sydney Tech? I think if you're in the 25 percent, and you mentioned consistently there, I think out of your three choices, Penrith or Sydney Tech, you can put both down, but those would probably be one of your higher choices. So having one or the other as first or second. And for your third choice, if you're really looking, or you really want to get into a selective school, then maybe putting down a partial, I'd say. But yeah, you can also have Penrith or Sydney Tech as a second preference, and one that's slightly higher. And I think Karthik had a question. So if there are 15,000 students, what will be the cutoff for Borko or Girraween out of 120? Again, cutoffs depend on how the school performed in that particular, or in the previous HSC year. So you'll find that with Borkham Hills, sometimes they're second place, sometimes they're down to third, fourth, or fifth. And it varies every single year. That also means the cutoff mark is going to change every year. So I wouldn't say there's a specific cutoff from that mark. It would depend on the school itself. And also, if you're asking more from the report perspective, I would say looking at the recommended schools is your best indicator. Okay, and one or two more questions. So, is the curriculum different between selective and non-selective or private? The curriculum itself, in terms of the content that you cover, no. But in terms of the depth at which you cover them, yes. So you'll find that across year 7 and 8, the topics that you learn, for example, in maths and or English, they're going to be fairly similar. However, when it comes to maths, for example, you're learning about algebra, you'll find that they cover it to a much deeper extent. So they might go into harder questions, they might have more challenging questions in there, but you're still learning the same topic. So that's how I'd best define curriculum differentiation. Okay, and I'll answer one more. So, okay, what is the success rate for my dream school? The last 5 trial tests in Alpha 1, I got 2 red, 2 green, 1 orange. Okay, so first of all, which one is your dream school? Is it the one in the orange, the green, or the red? But if you're looking at that kind of a spread, I would recommend, again, going for one in the red zone, one in a lower, sorry, one in your green, because you have 2 greens there. I'm probably go for the preferred green. I think you can put down 2 reds in that. Um, sorry, 1 red and 2 greens. I'd recommend, just because the orange one, because you only have one school there, it's a bit tricky. So I think 2 greens is going to increase your chance of actually making it in. Because there's only 2 reds, it must mean you did do pretty well in your exam. So having one of those, I think, would probably be sufficient. And depending on the school, again, that you have in mind, I'd probably go in that direction. Okay. Oh, someone's clarified that question for me. I think for this, he means his dream school appeared in red twice, orange once, and green twice. Ah, I see. Okay. Hmm. I think you can definitely put it down. If it's a dream school, definitely have it as one of your preferences. Um, I would probably just put it as the first preference. And in case you don't make it, just make sure you have some which are a little bit lower and in the mid range there, just to make sure you get into something. But Yeah, if it's your dream school, of course, put it down. Okay. So I'll come back to the questions. Feel free to keep putting them in the chat, but we're just going to quickly talk about some of the tutors and they'll just share their experience. But let's take a look. So for the first one, we had Neil Wang. I'm not sure if anyone remembers Mr. Wang, who works at Epping. So he was a graduate of North Sydney Boys, and he had some things to share about his experience at North Sydney Boys High School. So some of the pros that he found was there's a lot of extracurricular activities. This includes a Japanese exchange in year 11, where they had Japanese students come to their school and a portion of their own students who are choosing Japanese as a subject were able to go on exchange overseas. So that was a really good experience he found. Another one is sporting competitions that the school holds with their sister school in Melbourne. And this is a great opportunity for them to travel. So they had the chance to go over, compete, and participate in these sporting competitions. North Sydney Boys also has pretty good facilities. So some state-of-the-art gyms, good library, and most of the bathrooms and classrooms are fairly new. Main advantage that Neil found was he was able to participate in accelerated IPT. Now, this is throughout year 9 and 10. So, doing that, he was able to um, complete some of his units for HSC, which allowed him a little more time in focusing on other subjects. But that was a quite common thing at his school where the cohort performed quite well and they usually averaged a few state ranks annually. So, yeah, that's something to consider as well, going back to the accelerated programs. Another thing about North Sydney Boys was an emphasis on school pride, or as he liked to call it, Falcon Pride. And most students get along quite well with the teachers. There's a really good student teacher relationship at that school. Now, some of the cons for Neil was that he personally found travel quite difficult, being in the Ryde or North Ryde area, I think. But if you're living in Epping or you're close by to the station, then it's not too bad because you have a metro that goes to Chatswood and you can get to St. Leonard. Now, it can be a bit of a walk from the station, but if you travel by bus, it can also get quite cramped from all the city workers. Another con was that a lot of older teachers seem to have left, those that had really good reputation amongst the students. They're no longer at the school, so he's not too sure about how it is now. And also, there's no air conditioning as of yet, which is a big con. Okay. Another one was from Ella Huang, who worked at both the Parramatta and Epping branches as well. So she was a graduate of James Roos Agricultural High School a few years back. Some things that she wanted to share about the school is the cadets program they ran. So this is very popular at James Roos. If anyone has passed the school, you might see kids in their greenish uniforms. But yeah, it was a really big program, and a lot of students were involved in that cadets program they had. So Ella said that it really helped with her self discipline, leadership, teamwork skills, and also physical fitness and outdoor survival skills. So cadets also provided students with opportunities to develop some self confidence, self reliance, and a sense of responsibility. I think she also participated in a lot of camps, which were very fun as well. And that's outside of just normal school camps. The other thing that Ella really liked was Olympiad, which was one of the things I mentioned earlier. But she went on a Phys Olympiad camp, and through that, she ended up spending 2 weeks in Canberra. They learnt a lot of stuff, which really helped her for her HSC year. And she also got to study alongside other exceptional students from different schools and also, I think, from other cities as well. She really enjoyed the fact that a lot of her peers had quite similar learning attitudes, and that in turn really helped drive her own learning and self discipline and making sure to stay on top of work. So, that environment which all of the students are driven. That's something which really helped her, especially throughout senior years and preparing for HSC. I think one thing that Ella mentioned, which really stands out, is the fact that a lot of stereotypes against selective schools, the fact that students are always so academically focused, they lose out on other things like social and extracurricular activities. That wasn't really true at James Roos. Ella said that there were a lot of opportunities, and it was more about students going out and seeking those for themselves. it wasn't always as highly promoted compared to other schools you might see, like private schools or public schools, but they were all available, they were all there, and a lot of students were really keen to engage in those extracurriculars. In terms of cons, I don't think Ella had much to say about cons. Travel was a little bit trickier for her in the first 4 years, but in the final 2 years, she actually moved fairly close to the school, so it became very convenient. But yeah, I think she really enjoyed her experience at Roos. So the last tutor that I'll talk about is Jack Liu. So he worked at both our Bella Vista branch and the Epping branch. Now, Jack's situation is a little bit special because he actually transferred schools 2 times. He started off at Penrith Selective, went to Normanhurst, and finally Borco. I think it was roughly 2 years at each school as well. So some of the pros he found is pretty much all the schools offered lots of extracurricular activities, and he didn't really participate in much because he wasn't that kind of person to actively join and seek out those different activities. But he did say that the amount of stuff which was on offer was really good for his experience at a selective school. He also really enjoyed the different school cultures. So, because he got to experience all three, which I think is very special as well, he did say that he pretty much enjoyed all the schools. Culture was very similar across all three. And yeah, he was able to get along really well with all those peers. I think his favorite one was Normanhurst Boys, though. I think he really enjoyed being in his boys' school and just being able to be friends with everyone there. Cons, I don't think he had anything negative to say about any of those schools. Overall, he had a really positive experience changing. I think a lot of kids find the whole transfer process quite daunting. That's another thing. If you don't make it into a selective the first go in the exam, it's not always the end of it. You do have the opportunity to transfer in future years. But yeah, in Jack's case, I think he really enjoyed that. Cool. But those were sort of the main things. If you guys have any questions as well, especially about some of the tutors or any of their experiences, drop that in the chat. I'm more than happy to share. Okay, and we'll probably spend the next 10-ish minutes answering some more questions. Okay, so can you retake the test? No, but it just depends. I think what the context is. So it depends on the context. I think if you're talking about, you know, if you get really sick during the exam, there are certain processes that you can apply for, which takes into consideration that. But if you just did badly and you want to redo the test, then very unlikely the government will let you do that. Minimum band for Helston and Macquarie Fields. Okay, I think those schools aren't too high. Minimum, these are always tricky. I think there's not always a minimum that you should aim for. Just try your personal best. But if those are schools that you're really keen on getting into, I think having a rough idea of your performance, knowing where you need to work on, and just making sure you perform to your best ability on the day. Tell us a bit about Fort Street, please. Sure. What questions did you have for me? I think Fort Street in general, I had a really good experience there. It is a co-ed school for those who don't know, but Fort Street, it's very focused on arts. So I think that's a really big thing. Probably of the area it's in as well. If you think about it, Newtown, Petersham, those locations, a lot of the culture there was focused on music, drama, academics too. Most kids were, really strived to perform well. I think throughout year 11 and 12 is probably when things would get a little bit more serious. But year 7, 8, 9, 10, or 7, 8, and 9, a lot of it was, just about having fun and making the most of your high school experience. More information on transferring to selectives. So if you don't make it in for the selective while you're taking the exam, The other option is to transfer. Now, with the transfer process, it's different from each school. So that's something you can do your research on. But majority of the time, they'll look at doing an interview. You might have to take a entry exam, or they'll look at your school report. So those are some factors. If you don't make it in on the first go, you have to work really, really hard at your local school, the one that you end up going to, and make sure your marks are reflective of your ability to be in a selective school. But yeah, reports are really important. Almost every school will look at that. If you're getting A's and everything, really good comments on your report, that's something which will really help you. Yeah, it looks like we have a lot of questions about transferring. So, like I mentioned, a lot of schools look at reports. Otherwise, you also have to do an exam. So, it's almost like a second selective test in that way. But you'll go to the school, you'll sit the exam on a specific date. And if you do well enough, then you may gain entry into that school. And that's not really the same as the selective test. The exams that they have are a little bit different. What bands would you expect for Sydney Tech? You're probably looking at, it doesn't have to be the top 10, I'd say, but 15-ish, 25 lowest. Yeah. Again, it just depends on consistency as well across different subjects. But I wouldn't really pinpoint a specific band that you have to get in order to make it. Caringbur's a decent school. I think because it's a bit far from here, I don't know a lot of people that have gone to Caringba. I don't think a lot of our tutors, I don't think any of them attended that selective. But yeah, I think if you're towards the Hurstville area, that's a really good option. Hornsby girls. Let me try to think if any of our tutors attended Hornsby. Mm, I think overall the culture is really good. I've heard people mention that. Um, or girls' school, it depends on your child's personality as well. I think some girls find it, we get both sides, where some girls find it, really enjoyable. Other girls find that it's a bit too much. They prefer co-ed. I think it's definitely dependent on your child's personality. But in terms of academics, they do really well. You get high rankings every now and then. But yeah, I think the school overall is a good choice. Okay, any other questions? Richmond High School. Ooh, I'm not so sure about Richmond. I think it's a bit further out from here as well. In terms of that, is your question more so about whether you want to put it down as a preference or just in general about the school? But yeah, I don't think we've had much feedback about Richmond in particular. How to improve thinking skills? Ria asked. Thinking skills. So depending on the scores you're getting, if you're looking at around 20-ish out of 40, that's probably more of an indication that you don't know the content well enough. If you're looking at 30-ish out of 40, I think that comes down to specific question types, whether it's the visual reasoning aspect of things, could be verbal reasoning, finding what component is consistently losing you those marks. That's something you can work on. And if you're getting fairly high marks, generally say 35, 36, 37 out of 40, but you're always just losing one or two here and there, I think that usually indicates your knowledge is there. But you're more so losing out when it comes to a trickier question. You're maybe misinterpreting, misreading, or making silly mistakes, which honestly is normal. You don't expect to get through a test perfectly. But yeah, I think just depending on where your mark is sitting or what component of the exam you find hard, then knowing where to start and where to work on from there on. I think Courtney had a question about OC. I'll get Sophie to see if she can find that one for you, and she'll send it over. Based on my statistics, how much can a kid improve for OC in the final few months? Seems like we have a lot of OC or year 4 and below kids here today, which is great. So in terms of improving in the final few months, that's actually quite a lot of time. If you're willing to put in the effort and dedication, I think thing that's going to benefit you most in a very short period of time is having self-discipline, actually being able to know what to work on and be willing to work on those things. A lot of the times I do notice as well, it can come down to an attitude from students, whether you think, I'm not going to make it into this school, no matter how hard I work, I'm not going to get the marks that I want to, therefore I'm not going to try. So having a change in attitude, trying your best, trying to figure out what is causing those loss of marks, approaching it positively, knowing that even if you don't get into the school you really want, getting into the next best school, your second or third preference, is also really, really good. I think that's what's going to benefit you the most. But if you're willing to put in effort and make a change in the last few months, I think working really hard, finding out which areas to work on, knowing that content, practicing questions, having good self discipline leading up to the exam, all those factors are going to help you. And not just for the exam, that will help you in the long run as well. Mhm. Okay, I think we had a question about preference order. Yep. So that part, which I think we talked about earlier, probably wasn't too clear. But when you're putting down schools, so I'll give an example. Let's say you put down North Sydney Girls as your first preference and you put down James Roos as your second preference. Now, based on past data, I think it's quite obvious that James Roos is always going to be a higher ranking school. Now, let's say you get 120 out of 120, or you're basically the top ranked student from the selective exam. If you had North Sydney Girls down as your first preference, that's the one you're going to get an offer for. You won't get an offer for your second and third preference. And that's the one you'll have to decide whether you want or not. But if you decline that, you don't get into any school. So when I say don't worry too much about ranking, it's more so about the preference or the school that you want to go to. That's like, I think, a factor to look at, because if you really want to go to for example, Sydney Girls, but you decide to put down James Roos as your first preference because it has the higher mark, right? Because it has the higher ranking. Then if you do get that mark to make it in, you'll be offered that school and you won't have a chance to go for Sydney Girls. So if Sydney Girls is a school that you want, put that as your first preference. You probably wouldn't want to put James Roos after that because you're not going to be offered that anyways if you make it into Sydney Girls. So putting schools that are ranked below. But the rankings do change every year, and I think the internal processes of the government is a bit hard to predict. That's the general idea, though, of preference. You won't be offered the second or third one if you make it into your first. Are the Alpha 1 bands similar to the actual score bands as the cohorts are different? So we had a similar question earlier, but I would say it's fairly similar. The reason for that is because we are basing it off previous students. So what you're seeing isn't just out of your current cohort of 800 students. It's actually out of the few thousands that we've had in the past few years combined. So we usually take that and we base it off performance from everyone. And if you're Trying to amplify that data on a bigger scale, I think that's fairly easy to do. Generally, we take into consideration different factors such as kids that won't make it in, the amount of students that do get in every year. But that's all the math side of things, which our reports team does. But yes, there are different variables that we also put in and make sure the bands are as accurate as they can be. Practical last minute preparation. So, in the few days leading up to the exam. Okay, so for something like this, I'll try relate it back to what I was doing for HSC. I think that's probably the best example to use. But when I was preparing for my HSC exams, in the last few days, I wasn't focused on learning new content, trying to get as much stuff in before the actual test. First of all, because if you're trying to cram knowledge in right before the exam, it's going to affect the knowledge that you already have. If you're trying to fill your brain with more concepts, more ideas, understand more things, it's actually going to cause you to forget some of the stuff that you have learned earlier, right? You only have so much space. And if you're trying to put more stuff in that last minute or in the last couple of days, it's probably not the best for you. So, usually, what I do is try and make sure that everything I've done in the past few months, in the past few years leading up to the test, is solidified, making sure that knowledge I understand completely, I've revised and will know it for the exam. So, right before the actual test, I think the best thing you can do is some revision. Don't do anything that's excessive. Again, you don't want to break that pattern of leading up to the exam, you've done some preparation, and then right beforehand, you're trying to review everything. Again, that's just going to stress you out. I think best thing to do is just like what you've been doing before, aim to have a consistent routine where you're preparing or revising a little bit every day leading up to the test. You know that everything you've already learnt is going to you can draw on that during the test if you need to. You're not going to forget stuff. So I think that's probably what's most beneficial. And it's what I did and a lot of my peers did when preparing for HSC. Selective, I know, is a little bit different, but I think just having established a good routine by then and not trying to overwhelm yourself in the last few days is important. Okay. If you're struggling with time management consistently, I think by this point, from the sound of it, maybe your child hasn't really done enough preparation. I'm not too sure what the context is, but if that is the case, I think time management is something which you sort of fix in the long run. So at the beginning, time management usually comes from the questions being very hard, right? Content knowledge not being there, and then not being able to efficiently allocate specific amounts of time and not having the right advice while going through that exam process. But if your child has had an extensive amount of time and experience with testing, and you find that even up till now they're still struggling a lot with time management, I think that it's probably more of them losing track or not being able to keep up with what they should do. So you'll find that if you're allocating a certain amount of time to specific questions, that wouldn't happen, right? But if you're dedicating too much time to one question, or you're not really telling yourself, okay, I've spent already 2 minutes on this question, that's more than enough, I have to move on. I think getting into that habit and just reminding yourself, being conscious of it is really important. So I think that might be a reason. But if time management is an issue, then at this point it's just being really conscious of it during the exam. Maybe getting your daughter to try a practice paper and setting 1 minute timers for each question. If she hasn't finished it, she has to move on. And as she does that, I think she'll tend to understand roughly how long she has to allocate to every single question as well. She'll recognize patterns with, let's say, for example, more verbal reasoning questions. Those tend to be a either get it or you don't, right? If you get the question, you do it and you move on. If it's more of a problem solving type, then that will take a little bit longer. And again, if she has 1 minute to decide whether she can figure out the question or not before moving on, that will help her recognize those signs in the real exam. So when she is doing the actual test, she's going to see this type of question, know that it's going to take a while, attempt it, realize that maybe it's not the most efficient thing to allocate time to and move on. So I think just sitting down with her and figuring out what questions she should be spending more time on and not be will help a little bit at this point, at least. HSC rankings of Girraween dropped from 19 to 30 in 2022. Same with Penrith. Is there anything concerning about these schools? Not really. So you'll find that it's quite common for schools to fluctuate. Where it would be concerning is if you have a school going from top 20 down to like the hundreds. But yeah, in like the top 50 zone, you get a lot of schools that fluctuate. So that's very, very normal. And just to give you a bit more information as well, these rankings are extracted from the HSC performance from the previous year, right? So if you're looking at that particular cohort, doing really well, a lot of state ranks, overall very high band sixes for their HSC exams, then the school itself is going to rank highly. But yeah, it's not a huge concern for you guys. It's more just the cohort and that particular year's cohort impacting their school ranking. But I think something that's interesting was when I did my selective, because information wasn't as accessible back then. We didn't have, that much tech. Not everything was online. My mum actually selected Fort Street. I think it was ranked eighth the year that I did it. So she thought it was a fairly good school. But what she didn't do is do her research. Again, information wasn't as accessible that day. So can't blame her. But she didn't realize that Fort Street tended to fluctuate a lot. And the overall average, I think, is a little bit lower. So coming eighth that year was one of their highest years. And afterwards, my mom was a little bit upset. She was like, you could have done a little bit better. We could have put you into Hornsby Girls or one of those schools. But yeah, I think that's definitely something you can look at, which is the pattern and their rankings over past few years. But if it's just like one year they did kind of bad and their rankings dropped, it's not a big concern. Okay, so I think we'll probably finish in around 5 minutes at 8:45. In the meantime, keep posting questions. I'll probably just select ones which I think are going to be most helpful for everyone here. Yeah, in terms of our discussion groups, we do have Facebook, WeChat, Instagram, I think, and all of those we tend to post a lot of free resources in, a lot of advice, and anything new that comes up at Alpha One, we'll post in there. So you should definitely join those and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. We do tend to have a few live sessions or videos for question explanations, and I think monthly challenges too, which is basically a good chance for you to try a full exam set. Okay, question about partials. So two fully selective and one partially selective, or two partially selectives and one fully selective. Which option has more chance to get in, considering you have less seats in partially selective but more attainable? Okay, so I think in terms of that, it would be dependent on your child's situation. But if you find that they're again not scoring, or they're not very marks aren't always in the fully selective zone, then I would say putting down two partial selectives. So yes, even though there are less seats, I think with partially selectives, you do end up having a better chance at making it into one of those, especially if your mark is there, but you don't get into a fully selective or you're on a wait list. You'll just get bumped down into a partial selective. But I think I'll probably need a bit more information on exactly what the marks are like or your child's performance to give you a recommendation on that one. Okay, a question about can we base our real selective, I'm assuming you're talking about marks on Alpha 1 papers. So, in terms of what you've done at Alpha 1 and the trial tests, I wouldn't say purely look at marks. I'd say look at the ranking. So, ranking is always more significant and is a better indicator of how you'll perform. If you're generally doing quite well, let's say, for example, top 50, top 100, then fully selective, that shouldn't be an issue. But if you find that you're getting maybe in the lower hundreds, so five, 600, then it's a little bit harder to say because if you do want to think about it on a bigger scale, out of the 600 students, amplify that to across a few thousand, right? So it's going to spread your exact ranking and make it a little bit lower. So I'd say using the recommendations based on schools, that's a pretty good indicator. But if you're trying to use the exact marks, it's going to differ from every single paper that you do. Yep. So cut off for this is selective. That's like your school change. So if you want to change your selections, yes, that's on the 11th of June. When is it advised to start taking selective mock tests? Good question. So we get that a lot from our year five parents, especially those transitioning from WEMT. Now, the thing that I'd say to look at is, and this is more for like Alpha 1 context, but have a chat with your tutor, see how your child is doing in the end of term tests. I wouldn't recommend doing selective mock trials unless you're ready. And that means understanding the content, being able to apply your understanding and also being able to utilize exam techniques well. So, generally, if you find that you know most of the concepts, you're quite confident, you're not really lagging behind in class, you're able to keep up really well, and it's getting a little bit easy for you, then that's probably the right time to transition into a mock trial test. How's Parramatta High School overall? If you're looking at overall, location wise, very convenient school. Fairly close to Parramatta Station, I believe. It's the station and then one bus, or you can walk to the school. So, very central location. In terms of performance, they do quite well. I think they have a lot of students which are fairly close in that area. So what you'll find is with the school itself, there's a big focus on academics, but everyone is also from like a similar area. Yeah, I think my overall impression of Parramatta is quite good. Most people tend to have a positive experience there. I'm not too sure about the extracurriculars actually. That's something I don't think I've heard much about. But yeah, performance wise, there's really good cohort every year. How a few more schools, I think. So okay, I think a couple more questions about schools. So we've got Blacktown Girls, Glenwood. So Blacktown, I think in terms of school performance, they're okay. But if you're thinking about putting that down as one of your preferences, I'd probably say, again, depending on your child's mark, but I'll probably say something. You can probably place a school that's a bit higher and have Blacktown as your second and another school that might be ranked a little bit lower. But I'm guessing the reason you're asking is because you're in that area, so it's one of the more convenient schools. If you're considering Blacktown, then maybe consider a few others that might be in the area, such as um, I believe Parramatta is not too far from there, sort of on the same line, or maybe a bit further out. You have Penrith, but yeah, a bit tricky. I think location wise, that's a bit of a one that's not really too close to any of the others. Okay, we'll do one more question. So I'll see if anyone has anything that's very general and like to ask. Um, okay, so let's have a look. All right, so I'll answer one more before I do a quick summary of some of the points we talked about today. But this question, is it worth going to selective schools lower down in the list versus a good non-selective school zone, such as Cherrybrook or Cheltenham Girls? Um, okay, so I think that is when you can start considering other factors that will play a big part in your decision making. For example, if you get into a school that is fairly low on the list, perhaps partial, and it's quite far away, versus if you're right next to a school like Cherrybrook or Cheltenham, I might recommend that depending on distance and convenience, you can definitely go for a public school because you'll find that a lot of students who try to get into selective, even sometimes good selectives, because they don't make it into the first few preferences, they end up at a local school and they have a good reputation for a reason. So I think it's definitely worth the consideration, but understanding a bit more about the school itself. So that's when you can go visit their open day, take your child to the school, let them have a look at what the school is like, what the facilities are like. I think at the end of the day, if your child is really excited to attend a school, that's probably what's going to benefit them the most, whether it's selective or not. If they're keen, they're looking forward to what the high school has to offer them, they're excited to go there. I think that's something which is really worthwhile. But yeah, for all the other parents out there, if you are debating between a lower ranked selective school versus a local school, then that's when it comes down to maybe the areas they're in, convenience wise, what the school is like, what the school actually offers, whether it's a girls or boys school, if your child has a preference for co ed over that. But yeah, because you'll find that with partials or partially selectives, they do tend to have local students from that particular area as well. And if you're a bit concerned about, you know, being or having a child being in a mixed class where those students may not be as motivated compared to a well-performing non-selective, then yeah, that's something you can consider. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to do a quick summary of some of the things that we mentioned today. And I think hopefully everyone has benefited from this session. But as I said about location, I think convenience of transportation is really important. Maybe actually taking your child on a trip to the school, letting them understand what they'll have to do for the next 6 years of their life can help them decide and see if that's a school that they're willing to commit to, and also making sure it's safe, making sure they're not getting home too late. The trip itself is, going to be with friends or other peers. Minimum entry scores. So marks, you'll only be getting bands, so it's not a great indicator. but do use those OC and selective calculators. Do some of the practice tests that are on the government website. So those past exams are available. Go try those, see how a child performs, do it under test conditions as well. I probably recommend doing an exam, reviewing questions that they got wrong, understanding where they went wrong before trying the next one, and using those marks, putting it into the calculator and seeing roughly where that's going to get you. With selecting schools, put your first preference of school as your first one. Otherwise, your second and third options, they're not going to carry much meaning if they're ranked higher or if they're not really the schools that you want to get into. So make sure you understand that process as well. But it is all on the government website. So take a look at that, make sure you understand it, and keep on top of any communication that they send through, whether it's emails or on the dashboard. And extracurriculars, I think that's something kids, you guys can look into yourselves as well. So doing your own research, seeing if there's something you're really passionate about, such as music. I think we had someone earlier who was really keen, or had a lot of questions about conservatorium high school. So if something like that, if it is your interest or your passion, take a look, see which schools have that on offer, and that can also add to your deciding factors. But yeah, extracurriculars very different and varied across all schools. So HSC rankings, knowing that we do have accelerated high school certificate pathways where you're able to do certain subjects earlier. Not too relevant at the moment, but leading up to year 9, year 10. And if you think about it realistically, that's only 2.5, 3, 4 years away. So not that long, but that's something which you can look at doing before your HSC years. And final one, open day. So maybe go on to different school websites. I think a lot of them actually need bookings. So go do your own research, let your parents know that you want to go visit a particular school, make a booking or shop on the day and go around the school, see what it's like, see if that's where you want to spend the next 6 years of your life. Okay, so yeah, those are all the factors we looked at, and I hope that's been helpful for everyone. If you do have any further questions, you can always browse our website. We do have a lot of information and we try keep updated on our socials as well to give parents as much transparency on the exam as possible. But yeah, definitely take a look at all of those and follow our channel as well. Make sure that if there are any updates, you don't miss out on those. Okay, so thank you so much again for joining our live, and for all of those who are preparing for the selective, I wish you the best of luck. Okay, so have a good evening, everyone. Bye.